Maama Watali presents Strong Women, Strong Men series. Today's topic, Women Escaping Violence, Nowhere to Turn. Panelist Melissa Rowe, social worker and certified life coach. Dr. Bethany Osborne, educational development consultant. Zena Chaudhry, Chief Executive Officer, Sakeenah Homes. Sandy Onyalo, Executive Director, Ujeengo Global Community International. Moderated by Dominique Dennery.
We're now live in this webinar and panel discussion with the Maama Watali project. So my name is Dominique Dennery, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion. Very happy to be here today to support the panelists who will be speaking to you about their lived experience and different studies and areas that they've explored, and also inviting you to pipe in and participate with us. So first I'll go over a few housekeeping items, but before I do that, I'd like to call on Talissa Singh McKay to do a land acknowledgement.
We gather this afternoon on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. We acknowledge that they lived here before us and keep living here now. Reconnaître le terrain sur lequel nous vivons est une invitation pour nous à reconnaître l'histoire de la terre, des gens et de la connectivité pour donner un sens à ces connexions. By learning where we live, we honor the cultures and practices of the people of this land, and continue to be aware and participate in the healing process of colonization and intergenerational trauma. As a woman born in this country to immigrant parents, myself and my family are guests. Je vous appelle à reconnaître que vous êtes également des invités et des gardiens aussi. As an organization that advocates for support of Black women and families who experience personal loss, all forms of intimate and gender violence and harassment throughout a historically patriarchal and racist system, we recognize the myriad hardships faced by Indigenous people. Nous reconnaissons comme des personnes de couleur également opprimées, que les ancêtres des peuples autochtones ont été dépossédés, se sont fait arracher leurs enfants et leur culture a été dépouillée, que les esprits de votre peuple apportent la force d'avancer tout au long du chemin vers l'émancipation. May the spirits of your people bring forth the strength to move forward through the journey to emancipation. The patriarchal systems in place have damaged all of us, our families, friends, and our personal environments. Nous nous voyons à travers les yeux, nous nous embrassons et nous agissons. Nous ne sommes pas des spectateurs. We are not bystanders. As we celebrate the UN Decade for People of African descent, let us remember our ancestors, those who were enslaved, the mothers and their children who were raped and continued to be sold into slavery. May their spirit give us strength to uplift our voices as we continue their journey to freedom and equity. Alors que nous célébrons la décennie des Nations Unies pour les personnes d'ascendance africaine, souvenons-nous de nos ancêtres, de ceux qui ont été réduits en esclavage, des mères et de leurs enfants qui ont été violés et ont continué d'être vendus comme esclaves. Puis leur esprit nous donnait la force d'élever nos voix alors que nous poursuivons le chemin vers la liberté et l'équité. Thank you. Je vous remercie.
My background is in social justice, and I've had the honor of facilitating cross-Canada consultations on gender-based violence and doing quite a bit of work in this area over the years, and also anti-racism, anti-Black racism. And so I'll bring that lens to the way I ask my questions and how I invite you into this space. So welcome, bienvenue. I will call now on Susan, who is the founder and director of Maama Watali, to speak to us about this very important initiative.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here. The name of the organization is Maama Watali, which is directly translated, or it's a phrase in my mother tongue. I am from Uganda, and that's the Luganda language. And that term means in the absence of a mother. So if you can imagine anything, and this being a women's organization, if you imagine the role the mother plays as an anchor in the family, when the mother is not there, this is where this came from. So the organization is really centered about looking at the issues that affect Black women, specifically around domestic abuse or gender-based, however you want to call it, anything that takes away the joy of living out of a mother or of a woman. This is what we want to talk about. We're specifically talking about abuse, because abuse really strips one of their identity. And in a case where sometimes even if your mother is still there, you cannot even talk to them about what you're going through. And this is where we're coming to this space. We want to be a place as an organization that gives voice to women that are going through this. Or you have gone through it and you still, you know, somebody looks at you on the outside, kind of like we are today, you're made up and you're smiling, but inside you are a shell of what you used to be. We want to be a place where you can find a voice, you can talk to somebody about that. Something that you cannot tell, you know, your fellow parents at school when you're dropping off the children, or at the park, or your workmates. This, we are hoping, will be a place where you can turn and find some resources to help you, or somebody that can listen. I hope this kind of gives an idea of what the overall intention of the organization is. This is just the beginning of the conversations that we are hoping to have over course of time. So thank you for being here. And now I think when we did the, when the first community forum, we talked about what we wanted to name this project. So I'm gonna go ahead and call on Talisa to let you know what we're gonna call it, because we got some community feedback. And we wanted the project to be named by the people it's going to serve. So Talisa, if you can please let the folks know what the project is going to be called.
On December 19, 2020, Maama Watali came together with members of the community to share, to learn, and to grow. We came together to educate ourselves, to speak about the difficulties it takes to bring awareness to the abuse, oppression, and general ignorance of the silent traumas experienced by Black women in the community. We came together in a safe haven where we can openly share, grow, and build strength as a whole, as empowered people. What name encompasses and expresses this intent of our hearts? As a community, we have decided to name our project Strong Women, Strong Men. Strong Women, Strong Men is a clear, determined mantra to manifest within our communities and within ourselves. Bringing these issues to discussion at the table takes courage, bravery, understanding, and patience. Educating one another of the painful experiences in our community requires leadership and role models. This is what we are, people who are not afraid to express ourselves and ask questions as we rise together. What defines a strong woman? A strong woman is a woman who has a deep self-knowledge of herself. She aligns her world with what she values. She is confident to pursue what she values despite what family and society would say otherwise. Expressive in her own way, she encourages empowerment within her community. She is self-aware role model and a leader in her own way. What defines a strong man? A strong man is a man who has deep knowledge of himself as well. He is supportive and understands that he does not need to put down women to make himself feel powerful. He is a leader and a role model in his own way. A truly strong man lifts up others and brings others to power together. As strong women and strong men, We recognize the oppressions that began in our own homes by generational trauma, in the outside world from detrimental media and patriarchal laws. We recognize the scarcity of knowledge and education hindering our communities from growth. Our communities have been shaken to the core, but from here, we take charge. We build, learn, and encourage each other towards deeper understanding of ourselves and the world. We are role models and leaders. Together, we will design, create, and empower solid structures for our sisters, brothers, all members in our community, whilst continuing to inspire others. As strong women and strong men, we begin a new adventure together. Thank you.
We have 4 powerful women, strong women. So I'll introduce Melissa Rowe first. Melissa Rowe is a social worker, counselor, and a certified life coach. And she's made it her life's journey to support women in supporting themselves and recognizing their own strength, power, and greatness from within. So it's all about reconnecting with that strength. So she's traveled extensively throughout Africa, East Central, Southern, West Africa, projects in Botswana and Zambia in particular. And so she will be speaking to us about how to recognize the signs of gender-based violence and what to look for, etc. in a few minutes. Also with us today is Sandy Onyalo. And Sandy is now head of Ujeengo Global Community, an NGO advocating for human rights, gender equality, violence against women, and empowerment of marginalized community. Sandy is coming to us in that role, but also her experience at the City of Toronto in terms of community health and Somali newcomer women's organizations, and more recently as the head of the Ottawa Rape Crisis Center when it was still in existence. And the center's role was to provide a safe space for victims, survivors, and so a lot of innovative projects in that field. So she'll speak to us about her work here. She's got a lot of work she's doing in other parts of the world, and particular Guyana, Kenya, Nigeria, and the role of a rape crisis center. So we also have with us Dr. Bethany Osborne, and Bethany Osborne is an educator, innovative educator and researcher with 20 years of experience building and engaging diverse communities. Bethany is currently a professor at Sheridan College, and it's a professor of teaching and learning and an educational development consultant. Bethany has done some recent research on domestic violence in immigrant communities in collaboration with a number of colleagues, and brings this view to our panel and speaking to us about her findings as she explored the barriers and challenges racialized immigrant women are facing as they navigate services and support once they experience domestic violence. So, and then last but not least, we have our final panelist is Dr. Zena Chaudhry, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Sakeenah Homes, and you are Chief Executive Officer of a shelter, and you'll be speaking to us about the new shelter. It's a shelter for abused women of Muslim faith-based, so it is particularly specific and created in November of last year. And you'll speak to us about what your intention is and what the services are provided there. So welcome to everyone on the panel. So now I'll start with a question for Melissa to set the stage about what we mean. Let me see if I can see Melissa. There she is. What are some of the clues? So we know that violence can be very overt. It can be something that's not obvious, as conversation started today saying you might not be able to tell that a woman is experiencing domestic violence. And so what are the signs? So what are the clues or indicators to recognize that gender-based violence is occurring, Melissa?
I think as women, we all know when we are being abused. We all want to be treated and be respected as strong women, and we want to be equal partners in our relationships and in our communities. So to identify one particular theme in terms of this is where this is how gender-based violence occur is not exactly a way of describing our experiences, because we have different ways of addressing what is occurring to us and what is happening to us behind closed doors.
Mm.
And many of us are afraid to share what is happening with us, with our partners, for a number of different reasons, which I will get into later. When we look at gender-based violence from a broader perspective, it's important to acknowledge that immigrant, visible minority, and refugee and Black women experience gender-based violence in different ways. And we do have additional barriers that we face.
Before we go into the different ways, could you give us a sense of the different barriers, the type of abuse that, without re-triggering or re-traumatizing, but just what are the types of abuse that are not discussed, that happen, as you say, behind closed doors? And if you have some specificity there that you could give us a sense of what we're talking about when we say abuse and violence.
As a Black woman, who is from the Caribbean, I've experienced, and many of the women with whom I've worked, we've all heard the phrase partner abuse, battering, or domestic violence, which is used to describe the painful levels of physical, emotional, sexual, and psychological violence that occurs in our relationships. The domestic violence and partner abuse and battering refer to the physical and emotional and sexual aspect of this abuse. It can be very pervasive.
Mm-hmm.
It causes a great deal of pain. It is intended to victimize and keep us dependent. And one of the aspects of another aspect of this domestic violence is in sexual abuse. Sexual assault and rape is one of the most common crimes against women.
Okay.
Especially young women. And these acts are rarely reported because we are conditioned as women to blame, or as a society to blame, the victim, thereby holding women responsible for our sexual abuse and assault, and refusing to use, holding us responsible for our abuse. Or economic and psychological and mental abuse causes a great deal of isolation and creates additional fear and take away our power.
Right. So you talked about barriers to seeking help or barriers when you started to say, as a community, African Caribbean community, there are particular barriers that we face. So would be interested in hearing you speak to us about those barriers.
One of the biggest barrier is the systemic inequity that that exists, that prevents us from having the same access to services as other women, equal access, because we are so fearful. We are fearful of sharing what is happening to us, because we are afraid of what the response to our community might be. We might be ostracized by our families because we're taught not to speak about what is happening in our bedrooms, because it's our business and no one else's. There's the level of racism that exists within the structural racism that exists within these spaces that are supposed to be serving all women. But we have a tendency not to access these services. Number one, we don't know about them if we're a new immigrant or a refugee. Number two, we don't know about them, and when we try to access them, the way we are treated, we are faced with that isolation and discrimination, and so we have the tendency to say, okay, that service is not for us, so we're not going to go there. The third element is that we know, or we are sometimes aware, that the prison system is filled with our partners. And so we are reluctant to share or to report what is occurring, what is happening to us, because we don't want our partners to be caught in that legal system that discriminates against them. So we have a tendency, specifically as Black women, to protect our abusive partners from that system. So we then
we underreport or don't report at all, or
we stay in the position, or sometimes some of us got killed in that space because we are reluctant to, because of the fear, we don't report.
We're going to come back to you, Melissa, to talk more about some of the solutions, because you have been, as a coach and as a support in the community, there are some things that can be done to help our own. Wanting to go next to Dr. Bethany Osborne, and Bethany, inviting you to weigh in on what you've just heard in terms of the study. So this is, Melissa sharing the experience of all her years of doing this work and her own lived experience. And then you actually completed a study, a book, I should say, domestic violence in immigrant communities, breaking the cycle. And there's case studies there. So could you tell us about this, what the findings, this study, what it was, and then the findings that are most important for this audience to hear about in terms of our situation for immigrant communities and domestic violence?
The research study that we did was a research study in which we we created 15 cases from closed legal files of immigrant women who had actually experienced domestic violence, and the purpose of this research was actually to create actually an instructive text maybe take a step backwards was why my colleagues and I actually decided to embark on this research project was that each of us worked in a different part of the sector. And one of my colleagues, Archana Medkar, is actually a lawyer who's engaged in family law and has worked in the field for a couple of decades. And then my two colleagues and I are social work professors and have worked in different areas of practice in terms of supporting survivors of violence in the sector, and so one of the things that we recognized is that often as we were supporting women in different parts of the social service sector or in the justice sector, is that often there were gaps in services to support immigrant women in particular. And so the way that we went about, actually, we thought one of the ways that we could actually support that process was to actually go directly from the stories of immigrant women who had experienced violence, and to actually create case studies that could actually work as an instructive text to teach both students who would become practitioners in both the justice fields and social workers, but also practitioners who were already working in the field. And to look at that. So that's kind of the background.
Right. And to tell it as stories, so it comes to life that way, and then identify the gaps that happen, where people fell between the cracks. And,
where people fell between the cracks. And so that it was not just, this is something that is hypothetical, but these were actual stories. And so we started with literally hundreds and hundreds of pages of legal documents, and worked for about a year and a half, actually pulling those legal documents together. And then we had to get permission. We put a call out. We had to make sure that they were closed legal cases,
right,
and put a call out. And there were 15 women who contacted us. We went through an ethical process through both of our institutions. We made sure that the women would not be identified. So we changed lots of information in the stories in terms of, but they were all very eager to share their stories because of the experiences that they had, and because they wanted to be able to help others in similar situations. And
so give us a sense, Bethany, of the maybe just not the full range, the 15, but give us a sense of some of the personas, I guess, that you illustrated.
Yeah, sure. So we had a range of women who from 8 different countries, but then also from within those different countries with varying different statuses in terms of immigration statuses, anywhere from refugee status to people with landed immigrancy status to people who had permanent residency. So you had a wide range. Women who had children, women who were without children. All of them were some women who had been married long term, women who. So it was just there was a very wide range.
So what are some of the gaps that you identified? I know it's hard to summarize.
So some of the some of the major gaps that we identified were just lack of information that women had in terms of access to resources. especially also so language played a significant role. Immigration status, interestingly enough, didn't play such a huge role. So if a woman had permanent residency, she didn't always know that she had more legal rights than a woman who was, say, in a sponsorship relationship. So so much of information, and there was so much that what happens within abusive relationships. And I mean, I think the first panelist spoke so clearly to this, is that there's so much control within that relationship, is that information was controlled.
Right.
And
so people didn't know their rights. And so one big gap is not knowing that you are protected, that you have access to certain things. Was there another major gap that Melissa talked about? Attitudes, talked about the control, but talked about not being received when you go to a center, people who don't know your situation.
Not being received. Perceptions of law enforcement as well, and perceptions and experience of law enforcement. So fear of law enforcement because of countries of origin and experiences of country of origin, that honestly, their experiences in Canada really, kind of like the fears really played themselves out. So, calling and then not being believed, or actually calling to try to be safe, but then being told you have to leave your husband. But I didn't want to leave my husband. I just wanted to be safe. But now I'm being dragged out of my family, but I didn't want to leave my family, and I didn't want my husband to be punished. I just wanted the pain to stop. So a misunderstanding of intent as well. So there's no space here.
So maybe one more gap, and then we'll come back. But
sure.
So information, and then the way you're received, and maybe re-traumatized or victimized again. And is there anything else that your study brought
Yes,
up?
certainly. There were also lots of considerations around children. So there was a lot of blaming of the system of mothers, in particular, by teachers and by social workers. So mothers felt very accused of not protecting their children and not navigating the system well, and so mothers felt kind of almost demonized in the situation, even though they felt like, I don't understand what's happening here, but somehow I'm now being told that I'm not a good mother, even though I've been trying to protect my children, but now I'm being blamed for this. But I was protecting my children the best way I knew how.
Thank you very much for an overview, very quick, of some of the findings and some of those cases that you've explored, and hoping that your book, the reference to what you've done, can be made accessible to everyone on this call.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And we'll come back.
I can tell you more about the accessibility of it later, because that was
okay. We'll come back. I'm thinking that may be a good time to come back when we talk about the rape crisis centers and the different centers, and so we'll be back. So I have a follow-up question for Melissa, simply because you're hearing Bethany speak about this research, and you have done your own studies. You've done your own work, and a particular pilot project of peer support to train women about how to recognize abuse. If you want to say a few words about that, Melissa.
Okay, I hear some similarities in the work that the previous panelists spoke to, and the one that was done at the Rape Crisis Center, because it appears to be the same population. This one was specifically designed to provide women who were not having access to the Rape Crisis Center.
Okay.
An organization that had been in existence at that point, the organization had been in existence for 30 plus years, and many of us stayed away. Number one, we were not invited, and number two, when we went, we were not welcomed with a culturally appropriate service and way of treatment and all of that. The law enforcement, which I spoke to before,
yes,
blaming, the guilt, all of that. So the intention was to provide women with more information about sexual violence, rape, and also to provide the organization with some additional information as to how to provide culturally appropriate services for this population. There were up to 170 women that participated. 13 were trained. It was a range of different ages. There were some older and some younger women. There were some intergenerational issues with the younger and the older women in terms of their perspective about sex and sexual abuse and what is considered abuse, and again, this is not for public consumption. So these women, part of the intention was to have them have some basic training so they could support the other women in their community.
Okay. And is this program still ongoing? Because you're speaking of it in the past tense. Just wondering.
To my knowledge, there were recommendations from the women that it be continued. Sandy could speak to this. To my knowledge, I'm not sure how much longer after the research was completed that whether the Rape Crisis Center acted on any of the recommendations or not.
Okay, I'll go to Sandy next then. Thank you. Yes. Thank you for speaking about this particular project. So Sandy Onyalo. So many years of experience in the field of gender abuse, and you are the former executive director of the Ottawa Rape Crisis Center. Tell us a bit about the center and tell us how the population, the demographics of the center evolved over the time that you were there. So give us a sense, a snapshot. So Sandy?
So the Ottawa Rape Crisis Center was founded in 1974, and it was the third rape crisis center to be founded across Canada. And then to put it a bit into context, in Ontario, there are over 40 rape crisis centers or sexual assault centers, and they're all funded by the Ministry of the Attorney General. And the Ministry of the Attorney General provides core funding, and each center provides the following core services. So they all have a 24-hour crisis line. So a woman can call up who's distressed. It could be a recent assault, or it could be a past assault. She's distressed. She will call the line, and most likely she will talk to a volunteer. So all the centers across Ontario have a volunteer base who support the crisis line. And during the day, it's either a student or it's a staff member, but it is a 24-hour line. Also, all centers are supposed to provide what we call crisis intervention. So you could make an appointment for a counselor for different centers provide different services in terms of numbers, but it's usually around 3 to 4 crisis intervention appointments with a counselor, so face-to-face counselor. And then so the idea is that the counselor and the client are dealing with the immediate crisis in the moment and developing a relationship. And then you could go on to more longer term counseling, and that averages a year, sometimes longer. It's a bit difficult because there's a need for ongoing counseling, sometimes beyond the year, but then there's also a wait list. So centers have to kind of juggle between the two, and also group counseling. So usually when you've been in counseling for a while, you're sort of comfortable with sharing with your counselor. Between the two, they decide whether you're sort of ready to participate in a group format. Some women never want to do that, and some women do want to do that. So that's also a core service provided by all the centers. The other thing is that all the centers have a public education program, and that is also supported by volunteers. So the public education coordinator would go to wherever she's called, businesses, banks, companies, schools, wherever she's asked to do public education training, she will be out there in the community doing public education work, and also advocacy work and a little bit of community development work. So, and then she also has a smaller group of volunteers who do the same and similar work. And because for the most part, all centers will say the same thing, that they're underfunded, we usually either supplement funding from other sources such as the United Way, Trillium Foundation, and also depending on the particular need in the community, we will develop a particular projects or programs. So for example, at the Ottawa Rape Crisis Center, we ran a program, a very successful program called the Girls Chat Project. And we were in 5 high schools across Ottawa. And the reason why we ended up running that program was because we were doing, we were attached to sort of community, and some of the young women in these high schools, and they were young women of color, immigrant women, were saying that they're experiencing sexual harassment in the schools.
So tell us about that population. So bringing it back to Black women, racialized women. So what have you experienced? Like, you were there for 13 years, I believe. Huh? So in that period of time, until 2017 or whenever 18 or whenever this was stopped or you exited, what have you seen in terms of our population?
Well, even though there was a heightened awareness in the 80s of the Black community growing, immigrant community growing, that wasn't really necessarily translated into service provision within the centers. What the centers were doing was a lot of anti-racism training, anti-oppression training, but they weren't actually seeing clients within the center. So it was predominantly white women, knowing that they had to get up to speed with anti-oppression, anti-training, but the clients weren't necessarily coming to the centers. And I think there were a lot of factors, I think. One, because once the training was achieved, I don't think women knew how to get to the next step. So how do we start? If you don't know the community and you're not a community developer per se, you're more of a counselor, you might not know how to do community development work, how to do outreach and that kind of thing. The other piece of it was that down the road, centers realized that they actually didn't have the cultural competency to do the work.
Right.
So a Black woman could be knocking on the door for services, and you're more than willing to support that woman, but you might not have the competency, the cultural competency, to provide services in a culturally appropriate manner. And so it stalled a lot. And when I came into the Rape Crisis Center, late 90s, I heard a lot of frustration from Black women and women of color. Like, we've been talking about anti-racism and anti-oppression forever, but we're not doing anything about it. And so I had to help make that leap between what we know theoretically, the research we do, and how you make that leap to do some organizational change. So that was kind of, so only now, I think, I would say mid 2000s, were we seriously starting to do that work. And all the centers belong to an, well, not all, but most of the centers belong to an umbrella coalition, the Ontario Rape Crisis Center Sexual Assault Coalition. And it was difficult work. There was a lot of challenges. There was a lot of, we mean well, but so we were able to sort of hurdle those barriers. And of course, we're not finished. We continue the work, but it was difficult work in those days.
Okay. And so when we come back to today and COVID, we know that there's been an increase in gender-based violence and intimate partner violence with the situation where people are stuck in homes where they're not safe. And it's also impacts on the immigrant communities. Many of our communities are doing these essential service work where they're more exposed to COVID, et cetera. So there's an adverse impact there. So I'd like to hear from any of the panelists and around the impact of COVID on this situation of gender-based violence and what's available to women. And I'll start with Zena, because we haven't heard from you yet, Zena, and would love to get your perspective on COVID-19, gender-based violence, abused women of the Muslim faith, all of the isms that are in the way of getting support and healing. So tell us a bit about what you're doing and what you've noticed since you've started the center.
Sure, thank you. And first, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be amongst such amazing and strong and powerful women. It really is a really great honor for me to be here today. So thank you so much for having me. So a little bit kind of about Sakeenah Homes and what we've seen, I guess, specifically during COVID and our growth into the Ottawa region as well. So Sakeenah Homes was started 3 years ago as a sheltering service, specifically geared towards giving religiously and culturally sensitive services to Muslim women. So that could be of South Asian descent, converts, Black women, Arab women, from anywhere around the world, as long as they had some sort of cultural or religious tie to Islam or a Muslim community. That's kind of the services that we excelled in. And this was created based out of a gaping need that we saw within the community and within the services that were already provided. So for us, that's where we came from. But we have, this is one thing that I always like to express as well, is that we never turn anyone away. We have had non-Muslim women, we have had women from different religious and cultural backgrounds come to us, and we have never, ever said no to anyone. And that's because we know how it feels to not have services geared towards you, to not be eligible for different services. And so for us, we make a conscious effort to learn about different cultures, different religions, and ensure how we can create that welcoming and safe environment for the women and children who are going through such trauma.
Right.
So when COVID initially hit and we went through our first lockdown in the spring, which was, I would say, end of March and April, we saw a 700% increase in the call volume that we were getting.
Wow.
So we work across Canada. We not only have physical transitional shelter locations, which right now we have in Brampton, Ontario, Toronto, Ontario, and our newest one in Ottawa, which opened in November, as you had mentioned. But we also work across Canada in every province, territory, and major city. So we have remote caseworkers that work with clients who either cannot leave their homes or don't need to leave their homes. Let's say they leave an abusive spouse's home, but they have family who lives close by, so they can go there, but they still need help navigating the legal system. They need help with government forms and referrals. So that's what our caseworkers kind of walk them through. And we offer free remote counseling to across Canada as well. So for us, when we saw that increase, that meant we were seeing hundreds of calls come in a day, which would probably have been what we saw per week. And they not only ranged in the kind of, I would say, the number of instances of abuse, but also how severe the abuse was. For example, we have a case, and I've been given permission by that client to share this case. We had a client call and she said, you know, I've been abused by my spouse for about 5 years now, like regularly. And she's like, but now with COVID and with social isolation and, you know, physical distancing, my spouse has called my parents and told them that I have tested positive for COVID. And so my 3 young kids have to go spend time with them. And so he took them to his in-laws' house, left them there. She not wanting to face cultural backlash because, you know, a lot of cultures still consider talking about this as a taboo. So her not wanting to face this backlash, and sorry, I should be giving a trigger warning here. So I just want to say that this is, I will be talking in more in depth about abuse here, physical abuse specifically. So he sent the kids off, and she's like, he basically had a blank check to do whatever he wanted. And she's like, that meant that he didn't care where the bruises ended up. He didn't care if my face got cut, because it didn't matter anymore. No one was there to see it. No one was there to witness it, and nobody could help me. And so I think that's a really extreme example of what we saw. But we saw girls under the age of 18 calling us saying that, you know, we aren't being given food at home. Our brothers are, but we aren't. And they said this is not a new thing, but usually we would go to school and our friends knew, and they would bring us an extra lunch. And after school, we would go to their house and their moms would give us dinner. But they're like, now we have nothing. Schools are closed. We can't go to anyone's house, and we haven't eaten for X amount of days. So I think COVID definitely brought out a side of people where they felt like they were given a blank check, and that meant that they could do whatever they wanted.
Abuse
and they felt
the
like
power completely. And
exactly.
Right. And my gosh. Okay. And so tell us about some of the ways in which you have supported the women in this faith-based shelter, and what you think is important as, you know, places like organizations like Maama Watali look at what can be done. Give us a sense, and then I'll go back to the other panelists as well. What's possible? We've talked about the gaps. We've talked about the increase. You know, we've talked about more and more racialized demographics as well, women seeking support. So what are some of the ways in which you've brought about some relief and some support?
Sure, absolutely. So not only did we bring programs directly to clients and residents that met their cultural and religiously sensitive needs, but we also worked on training mainstream and other faith-based shelters that, you know what, we know for a fact that we cannot help every Muslim woman who goes through abuse out there. They might not even know about us. But if they come to you, this is what their requirements are. Like in Ramadan, they fast. That means that your kitchen might be closed at sunrise and sunset, but that's the only time they can eat. Or, you know, if they're in the washroom and, you know, they are able to shower at a certain time, but they have to pray. That means they have to wash their feet, and they have to, you know, do like wudu. Like they have to completely, like, you know, wash themselves, and that's something they have to do 5 times a day. Or, you know, they need a place to pray. And even if it's a small corner, it's 5 times a day. They take out about 10 minutes and they need to pray. And these are things that we saw that residents who were coming to us from other shelters came and told us that, you know, I was praying and someone urinated on my prayer mat. Or, you know, I needed to eat and they wouldn't give me food during Ramadan. So these are all things that we have seen that clients who come to us or residents who come to us have faced in mainstream shelters. And that's why we want to try and not only do the work ourselves, but educate others as to how they can help as well. And the same thing, we look to other faith-based shelters and to mainstream shelters to help us understand what other needs may be that we may not see. We are not in a harm reduction facility, but we know that there are Muslim women who, like do use drugs. So how can we learn more about it? How can we understand, what goes on, the sociological and psychological impacts of that? So definitely, I think opening ourselves up to not only have these conversations, but do something about it is a really important step. And I think for us specifically, like we offer everything from shelter and food down to life skills, employment services, whatever we can possibly do to get these women back on their own feet. And so for us, I think we've seen that the more services that you can offer that are sensitive to the needs of the women and the children that you're getting at your door, the more likely they are to come to you and turn to you for help. If they know you're out there, they will come and they will say that we need this help. And if they don't know you're out there or they don't know a service exists, they're more likely to stay in that abusive relationship and space because they feel like they're never going to be heard.
Mm-hmm. So thank you. You're talking about ways in which you can learn, each center, depending on what they do, can learn about other aspects, other communities. When we say Black, when we say of African descent, when we say Muslim, there's so many different ways in which people's identity intersect. So I'd love to hear from Bethany Osborne in terms of your experience of some of those. I hate to call them solutions because there's so much to do, but what are some of the findings that say, okay, if we put more emphasis, more funding, if we do things differently in this particular area, it might have a ripple effect. Zena gave her some of her perspective. What would be some of yours?
Yeah. So, I mean, I really, I think that your shelters, Zena, are an exciting example of what is needed, and what needs to be available for women who are seeking shelter, because certainly there's often I certainly have heard many stories about how similar to the ones that you just shared about, and so not just with cases of women who were Muslim, but there were lots of ways in which women, immigrant women in particular, didn't understand and didn't, it wasn't a good fit in terms of the shelter system, and the shelter system didn't understand a number of culturally based nuances in terms of women. And so I think that there needs, first of all, more investment in not just, I think that having shelters that cater to and have a really broad awareness of a, like, specifically for women of Muslim background, but also think investing in training for shelter staff around a wide diversity of needs within shelters as well.
Right.
And that's one of the recommendations that we definitely made in terms of understanding how people might come into the shelter system as well. So a more cultural awareness, and a flexibility, thinking about what the model of services are, and and how that expands the design of services, and how that expands to include a diversity of clients, so that and even thinking about but not just that design. So how does that interact with our justice system as well? So and thinking about not just the shelter system, but also longer term solutions as well, because what we found,
community development type of solutions,
right,
education
so,
solutions
right,
that Sandy referred
absolutely,
to, Melissa referred to as well, right?
and
Mhm.
longer term housing solutions.
And
So
housing.
shelters
Wow.
are great for short term crisis situations, but I know from having worked with women that often women their time in shelters ends up being too long, and then what happens when their time in shelters expires and there aren't any other options. So
Right.
thinking about long-term housing solutions, and that's a bigger issue
Huge
around
conversation.
affordable
Yeah.
housing and options for women who end up, even when their cases are resolved, their legal cases are resolved, they find themselves being very vulnerable financially. And so how do they reestablish their lives
Right.
moving forward? So more investments in a wide variety of solutions around housing and community supports and resources are needed.
Thank you for that. So going to Sandy and having you weigh in, Sandy, one of the concerns is that the Rape Crisis Center is not expected to reopen for another number of months, right? And we talked about COVID, and we talked about some of the extreme ways in which it can affect our racialized communities, us as women in these communities in violent situations. So, what are some of you mentioned community development, you mentioned outreach, you mentioned collaboration, you mentioned being more culturally sensitive, culturally aware. Is there anything you'd like to add to what are some of the areas of focus moving forward in a pandemic, particularly?
Well, Ottawa is a bit unique compared to the other cities in the province in that when ORCC was around, we technically had 4 centers dedicated to providing services to sexual assault victims and survivors, which is very different than any other city in the province.
Okay.
So it was the ORCC, the Sexual Support Center, and the CALAX Francophone, which provides services to Francophone women from diverse communities. And then we also have the Men's Project. The Men's Project is a slightly different model in that the other centers provide free services, and the Men's Project, I think there's a sliding scale for services. So even though the Rape Crisis Center is currently closed and will reopen in the future, there are a group of women who are working collaboratively to ensure that survivors, particularly, are referred to both CALAX Francophone and also to SAS for the short term, so they can receive services also. In terms of solutions, I think that we really, as Dr. Bethany had said, we have a long way to go in terms of making our services culturally appropriate, and we still need to work on that. One of the successes of the Ottawa Rape Crisis Center is that the complexion of the staff changed. So there were more women of color. We had Muslim women in the center. We had immigrant women in the center, and with the thought, of course, of attracting a higher and more diverse clientele. We had Black women in the center to attract a broader community. And that needs to continue. I'm a very strong advocate of educating men and boys. And in the early days, of course, when we opened the centers, our focus was on providing services to survivors. But I think that we're not going to be able to eliminate violence against women or sexual violence against women unless we deal with the behavior of men and boys. And I think that we should be, it should be integrated into our high schools. So the same way we had a girls chat program, we should be having boys chat programs. If I were to go into a grade 9, grade 10 class right now and say, okay, we're going to be talking about sexual assault, what does consent mean? Most of those boys will have no idea what I'm talking about. And the issue of consent is paramount when it comes to sexual relationships and sexual violence. So I think that we need to have more programs, not taking any funds away from women's services, but I think we really need to focus on educating men and boys and looking at some successful models across the globe. There are a number of really successful models that have proven to be to work, and we need to have them integrated into our communities.
Thank you for that. The federal government had started a consultation or completed a consultation with men and boys to get a sense of what was required there and what changes would be needed, etc. And it might be something to ask them for, the research. Where did that go? I facilitated those. So I'm going, what happened to that? All the results from those pretty deep conversations with men's groups, youth, all these models out there, men with sports and that macho culture that creates what we see acted out in high schools, etc. So might be something for to pursue that and see what happened there.
I just want to add a small point around the shelter movement, because the conversation happening also in the community is that we need to relook at that model of taking the woman and the children out of the home. Why are we removing the alleged offender out of the home?
We heard that a lot.
Yeah, and maybe we could do a cross comparative analysis around what it would cost to support the male as opposed to a woman and her children. And so that conversation is happening more and more now in the community.
Right. We heard that as well going across Canada on gender-based violence. The women were saying that, like, why do we assume, okay, fleeing violence, nowhere to run, go leave, because that's what you do when you're faced with violence. But why couldn't it be a different outcome?
Yes.
For the women and children, and is that based in our patriarchal mindsets, right? That the women are guests in their own home and don't own the property, right? So we've come to the end of our formal panel piece, and we have some time left to explore questions from the audience, as well as a few announcements at the very end. But I would like to invite the 18 attendees that are there. We're a total of 30 people on this call, but there's a number of people here to encourage you to put your questions in the Q's and A's, or the chat is probably easiest. And it could be an opportunity from us to hear from you. Again, if you're not comfortable under your own name, you can change that name, or you could actually simply direct your question to one of the panelists. You have them all listed with your chat, and any of them would be happy to answer. They won't say, oh, so-and-so asked this question. It's just, okay, here's a question from someone in the audience, and then answer that. So we'd love to hear from you. I see some names I know, but I don't want to put them on the spot, but would love to hear from some of you in the attendees. Someone is asking, how can we help? So what, I'll just possibly interpret that as an individual, who may not be as in this particular field, or working at a shelter, what can we do? And maybe the question is also, I don't know, about what else can be done, continuing our conversations about solutions. So how can people help? Melissa, I see you reflecting.
It's okay.
No, it's okay. So Zena, Sandy,
Sure, I can jump in really quick if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's definitely, like, what we have seen is there's definitely a number of different avenues and methods that the general public can help with. Obviously, if you come from an area where professionally you are able to help, like a lawyer or a counselor, then always offer your services, to shelters or centers that help people, so that they can, get that. Because sometimes the monetary, the price tag along with a counseling session, or the price tag along with, an hour with a lawyer, just to kind of help even navigate the system of how to get started, is too big for people to even fathom or think of. Financial abuse is very, very real. And so sometimes they don't even have, $2 saved up that once they leave, they have. So I think definitely, if you're coming from a professional field, always offer those services. Even if you think that, the shelters are going to say no, or the center is going to say no, you would be surprised as to what kind of professionals we do need help from. But I think also, as just general public, I think one of the biggest things is we still see this taboo, and I don't believe it's only a taboo that the Muslim community sees. I have seen it with a lot of other faith-based organizations saying it, and a lot of other cultural-based organizations saying it too, that there's a huge taboo around abuse and violence against women. And the more we talk about it, that the less that taboo is apparent. So I think definitely addressing this, talking about it, making it known that this abuse exists in every community, every socioeconomic status, every background, every religious background, every cultural background, it exists. It rears its ugly head everywhere. So we talk about it. The more we talk about it, the more power we take away from those who are abusers, and the more power we give to those survivors who need to express that this is real. This happens. I'm not, making it up. This is not for attention. This is not any of this. All those things that we hear, we need to give the power back to those who have survived this, and take it away from the abusers. So I think definitely that is a really big thing. Speaking up, talking about it, and making sure that we don't brush it under the rug and say, it's a topic for another day. No, it's always happening. So it's always a topic for today.
And shining the light on it. It continues to grow in the shadows of shame and guilt and all of that, right? So and fear, etc. So other panelists,
I
yes,
just
go
want
ahead.
to comment to add to what Zena is saying. The federal statistics tell us, all women abuse crimes are grossly underreported. But some recent federal statistics are telling us that when women do talk about sexual violence, they're more likely to go to a friend or a relative. And so, as the recipient of that information, there are some basic listening skills that you can learn. In the early days, in the early 70s, when the sexual assault centers first opened, the women who opened those centers weren't necessarily trained MSWs or trained therapists, but they were open and willing to develop a set of skill sets so they could support survivors. So for the everyday person out there who is maybe approached by a friend or a relative who says, I've been sexually assaulted, there are some basic supporting skills that everybody can learn to support that individual.
Well, thank you very much for that. We have another question here. What focus is there on prevention of this violence, so that we're not simply always responding to more and more cases of violence? So preventative measures, would any of you want to speak about that? And that might be one of our almost final questions. So what about prevention? We talked about men and boys. Sandy, you did tell us, first start with the perpetrators in many cases and see what can be done. Go ahead.
I have a very small story, personal story. So one of the things I think is massive public education. As Zena was saying, we need to talk about it. When my son was in grade 9, one of our public education volunteers said, "Oh, I'm going to this school." I won't say the school. And I thought, "Oh, my son goes to that school." And I'm going to a grade 9 class. And I'm thinking, "Oh, maybe my son might be part of that presentation." And so when the volunteer had come back, I said, "Oh, were you part of that presentation?" And he said to me, and I've never forgotten it, he said to me, "Everything that she said, I knew what she was going to say before she said it because I heard it from you."
Mm.
So if we can all teach our men and boys at an early age about gender respect, respect for women, what consent means, all of those things that men and boys should know, we go a long way in helping to not necessarily eradicating, but helping to prevent sexual violence against women.
Thank you for that. I have one other question, but for the other folks, Melissa and Bethany, you've unmuted yourself. I'll just ask the one more question, and that is about children survivors and how they can be helped emotionally. And so there's a question there and other comments as well, but just trying to keep up. But can we hear about prevention and also healing for children who are survivors of these situations? Who would like to speak?
On the part about the prevention of the violence, I think a really important aspect in this sector is not only being reactive, which is what shelters and things are, but also being proactive. And I think the proactive piece comes within education. I think that education, what Sandy touched upon, which is, educating our boys, educating the girls about what healthy relationships look like, what rights and responsibilities are in a healthy relationship, and what that could look like. Setting that example for the future generations, making sure that, toxic relationships that we see on TV or in movies are addressed and saying, that's not healthy. Like, it's romanticized, but it's not healthy. I think the prevention part and being that proactive piece is definitely based in education. And that education is through high schools. That education is in our own homes. It's, where we work, when we work with kids, whenever you come across something that may not be the best example of a healthy relationship, making sure that we address it and say, it might be romantic, but that's not a healthy relationship. So I think definitely that is something. And just quickly to touch upon the children who survive abuse or who witness abuse, I think definitely a big part of any program for women and female survivors is to ensure that we take their children into account, their male and their female children. And so, at Sakeenah Homes, we have specific counselors who deal with the kids who come into the home as well, to ensure that, that cycle of abuse it does not continue. And to ensure that we support them. They've seen this abuse, they've witnessed abuse, and sometimes they've been survivors of this abuse as well. So definitely making sure that we are there for them and helping them in this aspect ensures that in the long run, we hope that percentage, that chance that cycle of abuse will keep going, lessens over time. So I think definitely, ensuring that we have programs for the kids who witness this and who go through this is just at par of the female survivors that we deal with as well.
Okay, thank you. Melissa, thank you very much. Melissa, I can see that you're maybe about to speak. No?
Yes, I in the prevention process of education, I think it takes us back to the work, the two piece of research work that have been done on with particular women in the different communities. So for me, a large part of the prevention and education needs to be done with the women and the mothers, the parents. And not only that, but we're looking at the outside of people who are not. I want us to bring us back to the women themselves who are being abused and who are in those situations, who may not be able to get to the one shelter that now exists in Ottawa. I have a big concern about where are all those women going, because they're not all going to that one. But the education that needs to be continued with the women, the training that we started at the Rape Crisis Center, where is it? Even though the Rape Crisis Center doesn't exist, is not operational right now, will that be a part of the ongoing work that will occur with these women? They need to be engaged and to be involved in whatever the new program or the new center that is being created / developed.
So part of developing the solutions for them, as opposed to only recipients of what could be developed. You're talking about involving the women.
And having them be engaged, yes.
And engaged, okay. So I think this brings us to the end of our panel and our time together. Wanted to take the opportunity, and I see, Susan, that you've thanked our panelists warmly. Just a reminder that you've just heard from Melissa Rowe and Sandy Onyalo, Dr. Bethany Osborne, and Zena Chaudhry, and the book. Bethany is saying that you're publishing the book soon, and so that'll be available and provide some really important cases that can be used to research the gaps and the barriers and all of the above. And you're getting some thanks from different people thanking you as panelists, and let people know that you can follow what's going on. You can invite more people to these important conversations and continue to be engaged, as Melissa said, and be part of the next steps. And so Maama Watali is listed there. And also there's an email address here. So these are Facebook. So there you go. The mailing address is here. The email address is there, and is available for you to contact the center and share your concerns. Also wanted to thank the Government of Canada, Employment and Social Development Canada, funding administered by the Red Cross. So those were the thank yous.
We can't thank the panelists enough. I feel like I need to, just stay here and talk to each one of you, and I'm pretty sure we will be following up, and we will be, asking you to be part of our ongoing conversation, because, even just linking the work that you've already done to this, and will just be so impactful. So thank you very much, and thank you, Dominique. This was really fantastic.
Well, thank you for inviting me to help these women share their messages. So and good luck with your next steps. So with that, we're just going to sign off for the evening, and hope you're well. Stay well. Stay well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.